This video is brought to you by MASTERWORKS. If you've watched Wisecrack over the years, you're used to hearing about philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, Kant and Hegel, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, Sartre and Derrida. But there is one name that's come up a lot over the years, both because of his philosophical importance and his world historic level of crankiness: Theodore Adorno. Now, if you've ever heard the term critical theory, whether that's been in a college lecture or, I don't know, a YouTube video where someone tries to convince people on a school board that critical theory is at the heart of critical race theory and it's going to ruin your white child's mind.
It originally stems from the Frankfurt School back in the 1920s in Europe, based on critical theory, which was a Marxist belief.
It's largely because of this guy. One might say he's kind of like the Daria of 20th century European philosophy.
Her writing is bad. Don't people know the difference between good and bad?
He wrote a book, Minima Moralia, which argued that everything was fascist. It includes gems like slippers are monuments to the hatred of bending down. It also laments the state of modern doors. Adorno writes, technology is making gestures precise and brutal, and with them men. Thus the ability is lost, for example, to close a door quietly and discreetly, yet firmly. Those of cars and refrigerators have to be slammed. Others have the tendency to snap shut by themselves, imposing on those entering the bad manners of not looking behind them. But he wasn't just weird about slippers and doors. He was also a big-time cultural elitist and actively hated both jazz music and Hollywood movies because they were fascist. And honestly, I can kind of see his point about the big studio era of Hollywood movies, but jazz? Really? This right here, this is fascist? And while he's often lumped in with the Marxist tradition, and you can just ask the same angry people at the school board about that, he was so annoyed at the West German radical students movement that he called the cops on them for trying to organize in his offices, which makes him a crank and a snitch. And much like me in another, 5 or 10 years, he was so pessimistic about creating positive social and political change that he thought it might not be worth trying anymore. So, to paraphrase the American philosopher of crank, Jerry Seinfeld, what's the deal with Adorno? Was he just an old curmudgeon who overused words like fascist and totalitarianism? Was he an absolutely necessary voice in post-war philosophy? Or was he a little bit of both? Let's find out in this Wisecrack edition, was Adorno right about fascism? Okay, so before we learn more about a pretty cranky philosopher, I gotta ask you guys, do you ever feel like it's a little weird that we can sit around as humans and speculate philosophically about meaning and truth and the future of the world, all while outside of our minds, things are not going super well on the planet? Right? We have all this technological advancement and literature, and yet we're the only species who is consciously worrying about the future. Now, maybe I'm going on one of my classic unhinged tangents, but by now, we could say that perhaps the only lasting legacy the human race will leave behind is art. For centuries, the human race has relied on art to pass down the history of society, to educate people, to commemorate the world's empires, and it's no wonder that museums spend so much to preserve it. And now, thanks to our sponsor, MASTERWORKS, you can use art and technology to help prepare your own future. Because last year, all these tech companies that are constantly telling us they're gonna make our lives better and change the world, they lost trillions of dollars in value combined. And since all those companies make up about 15% of the S&P 500, when they lose money, it drags millions of Americans' retirement plans down with them. But the value of art has been less affected by the market. And in fact, the art market is coming off a record-setting year. Even the Bank of America believes that high net worth investors will continue to buy art despite larger economic concerns. Now, the logic here is that art's low correlation with traditional equities gives it potential to help insulate a portfolio from volatility. Just check the numbers. In each of their exits so far, MASTERWORKS delivered a positive net return to their investors, which is good because that means you're getting more money. And they're just getting started. Now, over 700,000 people have joined the platform so far, but Wisecrack subscribers can get priority access at the link in the description. So I don't know, if you're wary of traditional investment, if you really like art, if you want to put your money in something that's actually kind of beautiful and interesting, check out MASTERWORKS today and see how they can help you use art to secure a more stable future. But now, let's get back to Adorno and why everything might be fascist. Okay, so the truth is, Adorno was so cranky that he referred to anti-fascist movements as fascist. But it helps to think about where he was coming from. And before this video really gets cranking, pause and leave a comment letting us know what you think is fascist that probably isn't actually fascist. For me, it's birds. Now, I'm often hesitant to use a philosopher's biography to unlock their work, but there are some pretty crucial points in Adorno's life that help make sense of his pessimistic attitude. Now, he was born in Frankfurt, Germany, to a Jewish father and an Italian Catholic mother. When the Nazis came to power, he had just been appointed to a lectureship at the university in Frankfurt, the home of the Institute for Social Research, where he and his colleagues developed critical theory by combining Hegelian philosophy with Marxism, psychoanalysis, and sociology. Now, they used these tools to analyze capitalism, and in particular, to figure out why the revolution Marx predicted never came to fruition. But in a move of academic control that Ron DeSantis might envy, Adorno's teaching license was revoked due to him holding left-wing views and being Jewish. He went into exile in America in 1938 and didn't return to Germany until 1949. First stopping off at Oxford, he then lived in New York and finally settled in Los Angeles, the home of failed writers and academics to this day. It was here that Adorno wrote Dialectic of Enlightenment with Max Horkheimer, The Philosophy of Modern Music, and Minima Moralia. He also co-wrote The Authoritarian Personality with a team of academics from UC Berkeley. It identified personality traits that made people inclined to support fascism with something they called the F scale, which, to be clear, indicated how fascist their personality was and not how much Adorno and his friends wanted to F them. The researchers would use their wood smash scale for the latter categorization. Using this F scale, Adorno had an empirical case for his concerns that America was slowly creeping towards fascism. And in this sociological work, he found that tons of Americans he spoke to were legit inclined to vibe with fascist movements. And you can imagine that as a Jewish leftist in exile from Nazi Germany, this did not feel great for him. His negative attitude was also on display in his critical analysis of the astrology columns in the LA Times. He argued that these columns were speaking to an audience that both wanted to see themselves as far more important than they actually were, and who thought of themselves as either the beneficiaries or victims of a fate that's written in the stars. According to philosopher Robin James, Adorno used the column to demonstrate how the capitalist culture industry in 1950s America sold quasi-scientific posturing to help an audience excluded from educational privileges nonetheless feel in the know. In the same piece, James draws a comparison between Adorno's critique of astrology and the modern reliance on data to offer predictions on political and economic reality. For Adorno, astrology columns leave folks feeling that they are naturally deserving of good things, while those who are less fortunate are also naturally worthy of less. Sort of like the prosperity gospel, only with more crystals and less pastors with private jets. This also allowed people to comfort themselves with the thought that if things weren't going particularly well, it's not really their fault, as fate is simply written in the stars. This blind acceptance of their supposedly preordained reality and their attendant willingness to submit to the dubious authority of an astrology columnist led Adorno to believe these people would have few qualms with similarly submitting to a fascist leader. While this might sound extreme, Adorno thought that astrology facilitates an ideology of dependence, in which people want to avoid taking matters into their own hands and instead rely on various prophets of deceit. As he writes, people even of supposedly normal mind are prepared to accept systems of delusions for the simple reason that it is too difficult to distinguish such systems from the equally inexorable and equally opaque one under which they actually have to live out their lives. This is pretty well reflected by astrology, as well as by the two brands of totalitarian states, which also claim to have a key for everything, know all the answers, reduce the complex to simple and mechanical inferences, doing away with anything that is strange and unknown, and at the same time fail to explain anything. Much like how astrology might allow folks to give up control to the activity of the stars, totalitarian and fascist leaders are often strongmen who promise to take care of us, and those like us asking only for our complete trust in their own determining of our fates. Adorno had similar thoughts about jazz music and Hollywood films, which he called dream factories. For him, these products valorized the American cult of the individual. He thought that their message was usually that individuality is great, just so long as it serves the interest of the social whole. Lurking behind American individualism was a huge pressure to conform, i.e., this culture makes us feel like individuals when in reality, we are actually being taught to all be the same. You see this in everything from the marketing of cars to jeans to soft drinks around lines of individuality and being a free spirit, and the way in which radical, free-thinking individuals often like to get together in anomalous masses both online and in the halls of various government buildings. Adorno and his partner in crime, Horkheimer, called this the Yale lock picture of individuality, evoking a mass-produced lock that needed keys to be different, but not different enough that it would be impossible to produce them en masse. America demanded just enough individuality to allow for the smooth functioning of the whole. In other words, America turned individualism into something that could be produced on an assembly line. But it wasn't just jazz movies and astrology that exhibited fascist vibes for Adorno. He saw them all over philosophy as well, and most obviously in the philosophy of Martin Heidegger and his disciples. Now, we talked about this in our recent video on philosophers who are sometimes pieces of shit, but Heidegger was a literal Nazi.
I'm not worried about it. I know I used to be a piece of shit. I don't give a rat's ass.
Now, Heidegger's philosophy involved the identification of what he called a fundamental ontology, meaning that he wanted to describe what being is at the most fundamental level. Put differently, he was trying to figure out what the most important and fundamental aspect of existence was. And there was something pretty theological about this. As if a person or a group of people has some type of fundamental access to how things really are, they can use this as a justification to create the world in this image. If you need to, feel free to pause this video right now and Google The Crusades and Holy Wars. Adorno, on the other hand, was a fan of a more dialectical approach, which focuses on how what is has come into being via a process of dialectical development, which means that a concept never just is what it is in some eternal way, but those concepts contain their own opposites, making them more dynamic and alive. Adorno worried that a Heideggerian approach to ontology enabled an appeal to some first, most ancient, totally unchanging principle, which gives you a fixed standard of truth. Everything besides this primary principle is just appearances. Unlike a dialectical concept, this truth is fixed, like a statue carved of marble. So at this point, you might be thinking, okay, so Heidegger's philosophy wanted to find some primary metaphysical principle like God or a prime mover or something. What does this have to do with fascism or totalitarianism? Well, the partisans of this ontological perspective wanted to make arguments for how reality truly is, and thus how it should be. This makes anything that doesn't reflect that primary truth illegitimate. So, for example, let's say you're an American founding father who believes that God has given you a manifest destiny to expand. So that expansion is legitimate. And the already existing indigenous peoples in your way, well, illegitimate. Now, it doesn't take a huge leap to see how folks who assume this logic often end up believing that they are also the best and first people living on their land, and that everyone else is some type of interloper. Now, whether that leads to them eradicating indigenous people or murdering millions for a final solution, the idea that a group has absolute access to the truth of existence gets real fascist real quick. Some slightly less gnarly, but still honestly pretty gnarly examples of this are things like believing that on an ontological level that the role of men is to be warriors and providers, and that the role of women is to bear children and keep up the home. And while not every philosopher was a Heideggerian, Adorno was pissed that other intellectuals weren't doing enough to combat what he saw as extremely dangerous ideas. While some might not think that philosophers arguing about ontology would lead to fascism and totalitarianism, Adorno believed it was happening and grew increasingly disillusioned as no one seemed keen to stop it. But Adorno's increasing pessimism wasn't just grounded in his experience of exile. It was shaped by what the Nazis did during the war. Like most people who weren't in Germany at the time, Adorno did not have full knowledge of the extent of the atrocities of the Holocaust until after the war. And for the rest of his life, he had recurring nightmares, writing, "I have the feeling that I am no longer really alive, but am just the emanation of a wish of some victim of Auschwitz." In his book, Negative Dialectics, he declares that a new categorical imperative has been imposed by Hitler upon unfree mankind, to arrange their thoughts and actions so that Auschwitz will not repeat itself, so that nothing similar will happen. He later clarified in his lectures on metaphysics that by this he means not only Auschwitz, but the world of torture which has continued to exist after Auschwitz, pointing to the Vietnam War as an example. Because of this new era of inhumanity where murder and genocide were possible on an industrial scale, Adorno thought it was our duty to think and act in the shadow of these horrors. For him, the gravity of the situation demanded nothing less. And for Adorno, any philosophical project that failed to confront these horrors wasn't worthy of the name. Along with this, he thought that activist movements, which even when they had genuinely good intentions, toyed with types of authoritarianism analogous to fascist movements, as he thought the German students' movement did, needed to be urgently rejected. Now, while some folks might think of the Holocaust or the Vietnam War or American Manifest Destiny as exceptions to an otherwise moral humanity, Adorno thought we needed to recognize that these things happened in normal society through the actions of normal people, and that it could all happen again if we weren't careful. So even if Adorno was wrong in thinking that the music of Charlie Parker or the films of Orson Welles were gateways into fascism, the intensity of his social criticism was aimed at waking people up to the urgency of our social, political, cultural, and intellectual situation. Because while folks might not have walked out of Some Like It Hot and signed up for their local fascist organization, cinema had played a huge role in the Nazis' propaganda machine. And of course, in America, the birth of a nation helped lead to the resurgence of the KKK. While one of the world's great philosophers losing it about the astrology column in the LA Times might feel analogous to Don Quixote fighting with windmills, Adorno is noticing how these seemingly innocuous instances of a fate-based individualism quickly turn into something much more insidious. And it would be pretty naive of us to act as if these warnings were no longer relevant today, as many of our seemingly innocuous cultural practices are also imbued with some pretty not great narratives about who we are and what are our cultural values. While in Adorno's day, it was Hollywood films and astrology columns, for us, it might be sponsored content disguised as self-help advice on TikTok. Popcorn movies with underlying militaristic and nationalistic messages, or coded language about why diversity in schools is dangerous. And while we hopefully don't have to be as cranky and cynical as he was, because seriously, jazz music is great and we should all enjoy it, Adorno's fears about fascism and totalitarianism can remind us that the innocuous can easily lead to the insidious. And maybe to add a bit of classic American optimism to this warning, we can maybe imagine a world where small acts of egalitarianism and anti-fascism at a cultural level could lead to positive change, or at the very least, a slightly less dystopian reality than whatever all this is. But what do you guys think? Was Adorno seeing fascism everywhere because he wanted to? Or was he uniquely able to see danger in the mundane? And also, is a good trumpet solo a gateway to a totalitarian state? Let us know what you think in the comments. Huge shout out to all of our patrons, who I think of as our little community of advanced social research. If you're interested in getting involved and supporting the channel directly, which really helps us a lot, and also getting videos early with no ads, extra audio and video content, access to our Discord server, and oh, so much more, there is a link in the description. Check it out. But no matter what, we thank you so much for being here, for watching the videos, for engaging with us, even when you don't agree. That's what it's all about, right? We're not doing fundamental ontology. We're being dialectical, you and me together right here, right now. So thank you so much for that. Thanks for feeding the algorithm. And in the meantime, don't be a fascist, and we'll see you later.